Prologue. The CIA's Gamble. Washington, D.C., January 1961. A cold wind swept through the corridors of power in Washington, rattling against the windows of the White House as President John F. Kennedy sat in the Situation Room, his hands clasped tightly together. In front of him, spread across the polished mahogany table, lay a classified map of Cuba, its coastlines marked with red pins, its cities labeled with military significance. The boldest mark was on Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. CIA Director Allen Dulles, a seasoned spy master with years of Cold War maneuvering behind him, leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes brimming with certainty, locked onto Kennedy's. "Mr. President, this is our moment." Dulles's voice was steady, brimming with quiet confidence. He tapped the map with a thick, weathered finger. "Castro's regime is fragile. The people of Cuba despise him. We land here, arm the exiles, and within days, the country will rise against him. We strike, and he falls. Simple as that." Kennedy remained silent, his gaze drifting to the Cuban coastline. He had inherited this plan from the Eisenhower administration, a clandestine operation designed to destabilize and topple Fidel Castro's communist government. The concept was straightforward. Train and equip 1,400 Cuban exiles, send them into Cuba under the cover of darkness, and watch as an uprising erupted against the bearded revolutionary who had so brazenly aligned himself with the Soviet Union. But something gnawed at Kennedy's gut. He had heard the promises before, the intelligence briefings, the polished reports, the assurances of inevitable victory. Yet, as the youngest man ever elected to the Oval Office, Kennedy understood the weight of miscalculation. The lessons of World War II and Korea were still fresh, and he knew wars were never as simple as they seemed on paper. Kennedy leaned back, his sharp New England accent slicing through the tension. "What if they don't?" A heavy silence followed. Dulles frowned. "Sir? What if the people don't rise up? What if Castro is stronger than we think?" Kennedy's fingers drummed against the table, the rhythmic tapping the only sound in the room. "If we send these men in and they fail, we'll have handed Castro the biggest propaganda victory of the Cold War. We can't afford another disaster like the U-2 incident. The world is watching." Dulles adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at Richard Bissell, the CIA's deputy director of plans, who had overseen the operation's finer details. Bissell, always the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, we have trained these men extensively in Guatemala. They are disciplined, determined. With proper air support and coordinated resistance on the ground, Castro's forces will be overwhelmed before he even knows what hit him." Kennedy studied Bissell for a long moment, then sighed. "And if we fail?" Dulles hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered in his aging features. "Failure is not an option." Kennedy turned back to the map, the red ink standing stark against the crisp white paper. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that this operation could work, that this Cold War gamble could break the Soviet grip on Cuba before it tightened irreversibly. But doubt lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Havana, Cuba, the Palace of the Revolution. In the heart of Havana, inside a grand colonial-era building that had once housed the offices of Batista's government, Fidel Castro sat behind a massive wooden desk, his ever-present cigar trailing a thin ribbon of smoke into the humid air. Across from him, a Soviet intelligence officer adjusted his coat, the red insignia on his sleeve barely visible in the dim light. His voice was thick with a Moscow drawl, his tone carrying the weight of Cold War certainty. "They are coming," the Soviet agent said matter-of-factly. "CIA-backed mercenaries, well-armed, well-trained. They plan to land in the south, within weeks." Castro chuckled, the deep rumble of his laughter filling the room. He leaned back, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Let them come." He turned to Che Guevara, who stood near the window, watching the streets below, where young revolutionaries drilled in the plazas, preparing for the inevitable. "We have been waiting for them." Che smirked, his hands resting on the holstered pistol at his hip. "They think we are weak," he said. "They think the people will betray us." Castro nodded, his grin widening. "Then we will give them a revolution, our way." The meeting ended. Orders were given. Troops were mobilized. Anti-aircraft batteries reinforced. The beaches along Cuba's southern coast, those quiet, unassuming stretches of sand, would soon be the battleground of an invasion that would shake the world. And as the sun dipped below the Havana skyline, the countdown to war had begun. First ended Act 1, the landing, disaster at dawn. April 17th, 1961, Playa Girón, Cuba. A heavy darkness blankets the Caribbean as Brigade 2506, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles, approaches the southern shores of Cuba. The sea is eerily calm, the waves lapping softly against the hulls of their landing craft. Overhead, the stars shimmer, indifferent to the fate of the men below. This is it, the moment they have trained for. Their orders: land swiftly, secure a beachhead, and march inland toward Havana, where they believe thousands of Cubans will rise against Fidel Castro's communist regime. But from the start, things go terribly wrong. First blood, a treacherous shoreline. As the first landing craft nears the shore, a sudden metallic screech pierces the night. The boat lurches violently, its hull ripped open by an unexpected coral reef. Water floods in. Weapons, supplies, and men tumble into the surf. "Dios mío!" A fighter gasps, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he struggles against the tide. Others manage to wade ashore, soaked and disoriented, their boots sinking into the wet sand. But they are already behind schedule. More landing craft hit the reefs, some capsizing, spilling ammunition and food into the unforgiving sea. The brigade's heavy artillery and transport trucks? Gone, swallowed by the waves before they even touch land. The silence is deafening. The exiles scan the darkness, waiting. The CIA had assured them that local anti-Castro rebels would be waiting to join them. Nothing. No welcoming committee, no resistance fighters, not even a whisper of support from the Cuban people. And then, in the distance, a low, menacing hum. The sound grows louder. Engines. From the inky void above, T-33 jet trainers and B-26 bombers, Castro's Air Force, appear like ghosts. Their silhouettes flash against the night sky as they begin circling, scouting the invasion. Castro's trap springs. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the first bullets tear through the morning haze. Cuban militias, alerted days before, have been waiting. From hidden bunkers and palm groves, Castro's men open fire. RPGs streak across the sky, tearing into landing craft. Mortars rain down, sending geysers of sand and blood into the air. Pepe San Roman, commander of Brigade 2506, ducks behind a sand dune, gripping his radio. His men are pinned down. "Fuego! Devuélvanles el fuego!" he roars, urging his soldiers forward. But they are outgunned and outnumbered. The skies, once their escape route, now belong to Castro. San Roman grabs his radio, his voice frantic. "Where are our planes?" Silence. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy hesitates. He had authorized a first airstrike against Castro's forces the day before, but fearing Soviet retaliation, he had canceled the second wave. Now, Castro's jets dominate the sky, hunting the invaders like prey. Act 2. Castro's Revenge. The noose tightens. April 18, 1961. The swamps run red. The sun rises over Playa Girón, revealing the scale of the disaster. Burning jeeps and bodies litter the beaches. Cuban militias push forward, forcing the exiles into the nearby Zapata swamp. a maze of thick mangroves, sucking mud and hidden snipers, and at the head of the counterattack? Fidel Castro himself, dressed in olive fatigues, his iconic beard dripping with sweat. Castro surveys the battlefield with calculated fury. From his command post, he barks orders into his radio. Drive them into the marshes, no mercy. T-34. Tanks crush the beachhead. From the northern roads, Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks roll forward, flattening everything in their path. Their turrets pivot, belching fire, shattering machine gun nests, and sending exile fighters scattering. Men dive for cover, but the swamp offers no protection against the relentless onslaught. With every passing hour, the beachhead shrinks. Air ambush, Castro's Falcons strike above. Captain Enrique Carreras, one of Castro's top pilots, adjusts his targeting sights. His British-made Sea Fury fighter locks onto a cluster of fleeing exiles. "For Cuba!" he radios before squeezing the trigger. Heavy machine gun rounds tear through an exile ammunition truck, setting off a chain of deafening explosions. The sky fills with black smoke as flames consume men and weapons alike. A propaganda coup. By midday, the first prisoners are taken. Camera crews arrive, ordered by Castro to document the invasion's failure. A Cuban lieutenant smirks at the lens, waving at the captured exiles kneeling in the sand. "Look, Yankees, your puppets beg for mercy." The footage will soon be broadcast worldwide, a humiliation for the U.S. government. In the White House, Kennedy watches the newsreels in silence, his face pale. "We're getting torn apart," he mutters. ACT-3, The Last Stand. Save yourselves. April 19th, 1961, The Final Hours. The jungle reeks of gunpowder, blood, and sweat. What remains of Brigade 2506 is now cornered at Playa Girón. The swamps to the north are impassable. The beaches are littered with the dead. Their ammunition is nearly gone. Exile Commander Hernando Oliva knows this is the end, but surrender is not an option. "One last charge," he tells his men. With a desperate yell, Oliva leads the final counterattack. Grenades sail through the air. A Cuban T-34 bursts into flames. The exiles fight like demons. But for every Cuban tank they take out, more arrive. No escape offshore. The USS Essex, an American aircraft carrier, lurks in the distance. Inside, U.S. Navy pilots sit in their cockpits, waiting for the order to launch. But Kennedy's voice crackles over the radio. "Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. The exiles are on their own." At the last functioning radio outpost, exile radio operator Roberto Perez grips his microphone, his voice trembling. This is Playa Girón. We need..." A burst of gunfire. The radio falls silent. Castro's triumph. By noon, the last shots fade. 1,200 men surrender. In the smoldering wreckage, Fidel Castro strides through the battlefield, kicking a discarded U.S. rifle. A journalist approaches, microphone in hand. Castro grins. "Tell Kennedy." He pauses, his eyes burning with triumph. This is just the beginning. Act 4. Aftermath. A Cold War turning point. Havana, May 1961. Victory smells like gunpowder and cigar smoke. The streets of Havana erupt in celebration. A sea of red Soviet flags waves above cheering crowds as Fidel Castro, clad in his olive fatigues, soaks in his moment of triumph. From the steps of the presidential palace, Castro raises a clenched fist to the thousands chanting his name. Behind him, his closest commanders, Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, stand with arms crossed, nodding approvingly. "This invasion was not just an attack on Cuba," Castro thunders, his voice carrying through loudspeakers across the city. "This was an attack on all oppressed peoples of the world. And what did the mighty Yankees learn? That Cuba does not kneel." The crowd erupts again. The revolution has not just survived, it has been immortalized in fire and blood, prisoners as pawns. But behind the celebrations, in the dark, damp cells of Fortaleza de la Cabaña prison, The defeated exiles of Brigade 2506 sit in silence. 1,200 men, shackled, bruised, their uniforms torn. The cells stink of sweat and despair. The air is thick with whispered prayers. Every day, Castro's interrogators pull prisoners from their cells, forcing them to confess their Yankee imperialist crimes before cameras. The footage floods Cuban airwaves, turning the exiles into living propaganda. "These are the mercenaries Kennedy sent," a broadcaster sneers as the camera zooms in on sunken faces. Some exiles glare in defiance, others weep. The world watches. The U.S. government is humiliated. Months later, Kennedy finally negotiates their release, but not for free. In exchange for the prisoners, Castro demands $53 million in food and medicine. "They wanted to bring us to our knees," Castro smirks as he signs the deal. "Now they feed our revolution." The exiles, broken but alive, return home to Miami. They do not return as heroes. To their fellow Cuban refugees, they are the men who failed to take back their country. Khrushchev's gambit, "The missiles are coming Moscow," 1961. In the Kremlin, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev watches the Cuban victory with keen interest. He puffs on his cigarette, flipping through a classified intelligence report. The conclusion is clear. The United States is weak. Kennedy is hesitant. He will not risk direct war. A slow smile creeps across Khrushchev's face. He leans back in his chair, tapping his fingers against his desk. If America failed with 1,400 men, what will they do when we place nuclear missiles in Cuba? Thus begins the path to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the closest the world will ever come to nuclear annihilation. And it all started at the Bay of Pigs. CIA in chaos, Kennedy's wrath. Washington, D.C., May 1961. At Langley headquarters, the CIA is in full damage control. Analysts burn documents. Senior officers shift blame. Director Allen Dulles, once untouchable, now faces Kennedy's cold fury. "How did we miss this?" Kennedy demands, slamming his fist onto the resolute desk in the Oval Office. "How did we not know Castro had tanks, artillery? Why weren't my pilots in the air?" No answer comes. The silence damns Dulles more than any words. A week later, Kennedy signs the order. Dulles is fired. But the president knows this failure has consequences beyond politics. Soviet spies are watching, the world is watching, and in the jungles of Vietnam, another enemy, the Viet Cong, is already studying America's hesitation, preparing for the next great war. Epilogue: Ghosts of Playa Girón. Present day, the Bay of Pigs. The waters of Playa Girón are calm now. The sun rises over the white sands, waves lapping gently at the shore. But the past still lingers here. Half buried in the surf, the rusted hull of the Rio Escondido, one of the first exile supply ships destroyed by Castro's planes, still leaks oil into the sea. The wreckage stands like a tombstone, a silent witness to the men who fought and died here. Further down the beach, an elderly man kneels in the sand. His face is worn, lined by time and loss. His trembling fingers sift through the grains, as if searching for something lost decades ago. "We were so sure," he murmurs. "We thought we would win. We thought they would come for us." The wind carries no answer. Havana, Castro's legacy. In the heart of Havana, a towering bronze statue of Fidel Castro watches over the city. Pigeons roost on his outstretched arm. Tourists snap photos. The revolution outlived him. The Bay of Pigs outlived Kennedy. And still, the swamp whispers, "What if the U.S. had sent the jets?" The end.